Bible teaching, scriptural analysis of tough topics facing the Christian community today, and interviews with theologians and apologists. And today, my guest is none other than J. Warner Wallace. I've been meaning to meet you and speak with you for some time. So, how are you doing today, Jay?
Doing well. I'm glad to be with you. It's going to be
Good,
good.
good. Yeah. So one thing I found refreshing about your style of apologetics is it's not very polemical. I in the apologetics world, we can get really bogged down with a lot of the negativity. This speaker attacks this false teacher or this
Yeah,
false teaching.
right.
It's a lot of negative, negative, negative. And one thing when I the first book I ever read by you was a person of
Mm,
interest, and it just stood out to me right away. I was like, oh, this is like a breath of fresh air. They didn't have that same kind of negative feel like we're going after
mm,
this group or which has
right.
its place. We need to call out wolves, but it was nice to see a totally different way of doing apologetics. And I'm gonna hop right in here with some questions that I wrote down as I was studying Cold Case Christianity, the expanded edition that you did.
Yeah, Gabriel, and the point you're making, I don't really usually address it, but it's a good point.
Yeah.
And the point is that yes, we do have lots of places where people will make a claim, and we want to be able to respond to those claims. And I totally get that. There's a place for that. I think that for me, that this was really kind of an old school approach. Um, as a detective, if you're on the stand and you seem like you really have a horse in the race, I don't want to have a horse in the race. I just want to be as neutral as I can. Now, once you discover something's true, you're passionate about it.
Yeah.
But I don't need to be aggressive toward the defense attorney, right?
Yeah.
Even though I might feel, inside like, wow, aggressive about it. But I don't need to do that. I don't. First of all, I think it betrays our character,
Yeah.
and we do have some character issues here. If Christianity is true and our identity is in Christ, then we have to be truthful. And we
Mhm.
have to be concerned about justice and truth, but we also have to be expressing the fullness of grace and mercy. So how do you do that, right? So I just feel like, hey, I'll make a positive case for what I believe is true. I don't have to knock down the negative case here. I'll make the positive case. And lots of people will come around and make claims, counterclaims. Great, good for them. I don't necessarily have to respond to every single counterclaim because I think we can get lost in the weeds. Here's one of the problems we have, not a problem, but just the
Yeah.
truth of our case. Our case is cumulative.
Yeah.
So it's not like there's just one. We're not saying, well, we know this is true because we have this one event or this, well, of course, the resurrection is an event, but we have this one piece of evidence and this one reason for believing the one piece of evidence. No, it turns out we're building our case on lots of little details, lots of little, I call paper cuts. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. You're constantly building this case cumulatively. And because it's cumulative, and maybe I've got 100 reasons why I believe this event occurred, you'll see that online people will attack, they've got 100 things they can attack now because it's a cumulative case.
Yeah.
And often they'll attack those 100 things. That's why I would say, yes, it's the strength of the entire case that is compelling. And we can often, defense attorneys do this all the time, where they get lost, kind of, they don't see the forest for the tree, right? So
Yeah.
they're focusing on one tree and ignoring the fact that, yeah, I'm not putting my case on that one thing. It's on the cumulative strength of 100 things that point to the same inference. And so that's why, I could spend a lot of time defending each one of these paper cuts. But the reality of it is it's the a robust cumulative case that I thought was compelling as somebody who was an investigator who was not raised in a Christian worldview.
Yeah. Absolutely. One thing that's really cool about how you do apologetics is you're using the skill set God gave you. You're using the skills that you learned from your secular profession as a police officer. Your exact title was crime scene detective. I want to make sure I get it right.
No, so what we did, so I worked a number of different assignments as an
Yeah.
investigator. I worked undercover for a number of years, and I was actually working undercover when I first walked into that church.
Yeah.
And in that position, what would they have called us? Well, to be honest, they would say you're in the back room, which is what we used to call our undercover detectives, and we were investigators. I was already had a senior investigator pay status. But would you have called us a detective in those days? No, because we're working undercover. Now, what kind of cases did we work? Everything from robberies to murders, burglaries to robberies to murders. Those are the things we would work. Now, I eventually got assigned to robbery homicide, where I worked homicides, fresh homicides, and then
Yeah.
at some point, I started working cold cases. But to be honest, I had started working cold cases much earlier, just because my dad had an open case that intrigued me
Yeah.
involving a 10-year-old girl. And so back in the mid 90s, I started reading through all of the files that I could find. And there's a ton that were off-site that I couldn't have access to for many years, but I eventually got access to everything. And that case didn't solve until 2019. So I started that looking at that. That was 1972 case, and I started looking at it probably in the mid 90s, and didn't really have the authority to completely stop everything I was doing and work it full time until the 2000s.
Yeah.
And then eventually it went cold again, and we didn't finally finish it until 2019. And based on really the appearance of the emergence of ancestry DNA, right around 2017, our agency started partnering with companies that were doing ancestry DNA, and so we were able to use the ancestry. But that skill was not there. That technology was not there when I first started reading through the case in the 90s, and it certainly wasn't there in the 2000s when I actually had full possession of the case. What my title has been over the years is a homicide detective. Even when you're working cold cases, those are all murders.
Yeah.
So on my card, I'm trying to remember if it said cold case homicides or if it just said homicide, but one of those two.
Okay. Um, and you use that expertise to see the gospel accounts as as eyewitness testimony. And so you're using the lingo, you're using the terminology that from your time as a detective, and you're seeing, hey, this is gospel accounts, these are eyewitness testimony. How did your expertise lead you to that conclusion that this is eyewitness testimony we're looking at in the gospel accounts?
Well, and lots of people will claim they're not eyewitness testimony. They'll say they were written too late, or they'll say it's not, Luke's not an eyewitness. Well, he's not. But
Mm.
remember, the detective who takes the report from the eyewitness is not an eyewitness himself.
Yeah.
He's just the report writer. And we don't just give a piece of paper to an eyewitness and say, write down anything you want. No, we ask questions, and then we take our notes, and then we write a report about what the witness said. And often we'll let the witness read the report to make sure if I'm going to quote him, that I'm not misquoting him. Now, remember, a lot of the casework that I'm doing, because it's back from the 70s and 80s, they didn't have the technology we have today where we would record everything and transcribe stuff later.
Yeah.
So basically, you were taking notes and you were writing a supplemental report that contains the eyewitness account of that witness. In a
Mm.
similar way, Luke is not an eyewitness, but he's writing a supplemental report having spoken to the
Yeah.
eyewitnesses. So even though his account is not written by somebody who was actually there to see it, we would say that's another supplemental report of an eyewitness account. It's just not Luke's. The
Yeah.
same way it's not the detectives. So those kinds of accounts come in. Now, Mark, for example, Mark's not an eyewitness that we can say with certainty
Yeah.
about any of the events in the Gospels, but there is an early church tradition, and I think it's backed up evidentially in the Gospel of Mark, that Mark is closely connected to Peter, and that this is actually Peter's account as it was told to Mark in Rome. And I think there's good reasons to believe that. I could make a detailed case for that. But the whole point is, again, you would have an eyewitness account that is simply written by somebody who is talking to the eyewitness. Then Matthew and John, they would be their own eyewitness accounts if those are legitimately the writings of Matthew and John. So I get it. I get it that there's lots of things you could challenge here. You could challenge, well, were those really written by Matthew and John? You
Yeah.
could challenge, well, were they really written early enough to have been written by eyewitnesses at all? Those are legitimate challenges. And those are the same things we face when you investigate cold cases. It's the four criteria for eyewitnesses that are in the jury instructions in every state in America. And those four criteria are basically, were they written early enough to be written by somebody who was there to see what they said they saw? Two, can they be corroborated in some way, even though the corroboration is not going to be a video, most likely in a cold case,
Yeah.
because we didn't have that kind of technology. It's going to be a number of touch point corroborations. And then third, do they change their story over time? Were they honest and accurate over time? And four, do they possess a bias that would cause them, motivate them to lie to us? And bias only comes in three shapes. Three flavors. So those are the criteria that I just knew I would always apply And I had this, it really was my dad's case again that really shaped my
Yeah.
thinking on this because it was the first case I ever looked at. And we don't assign, sadly, not every agency in America has the funding for a cold case team. We certainly didn't. These were collateral duties. And it meant that anyone who was working in detectives, if they had some downtime and they were willing to look at a case, they could open it. They could at least open the notebook where
Mhm.
they had, and hopefully this old notebook had most of the reports from 30 years ago. Remember, these are cases that nobody thought was ever going to get worked, were ever going to get worked again.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of pulling together pieces. I can tell you, it might take you years to figure, you'll find something years later. You're like, what in the world? How did this sit here for years and nobody even knew it? That's the kind of cold case that you go through.
See.
So I was doing that with this, my dad's case. And my dad's case was an unsolved murder of a 10-year-old girl.
Mm.
There were over about 500 lead cards. We used to use written lead cards in those
Mhm.
days. That about 4 or 5 detectives worked simultaneously. And a lot of the stuff they collected was not legitimate. I mean, these were things that people were saying that weren't true. Well, how do you know they weren't true? That's the 4-point test. So that 4-point test will not only verify if someone's telling you the truth, or at least is there a witness making a claim, but it'll also help you weed out the people who aren't real witnesses, who
Yeah.
aren't making legitimate claims. So that's what I knew. That's the only process that I knew. And so I walk into this church with Susie, and I'm not. I would be more than willing to do whatever, if it's good for Susie, I'm in.
Yeah.
I don't have to believe it. It doesn't have to be good for me. It's like if your wife said, "Hey, I love this restaurant and I want to go once a week," and you don't even like it, but
Yeah.
you love your wife, so you sit through a meal you don't like
Wise man.
because she loves to eat there, right?
Yeah.
So the same kind of thing. And I'm sitting there, and the pastor said that Jesus was the smartest man who ever lived, and I decided to buy a Bible and see if that was true. And what struck me right away were the subtle differences between the accounts because they are different
Yeah.
and they don't always feel like they're if you're not familiar with eyewitness testimony, you might read it and say, "Wow, I'm not even sure you can reconcile that. That feels like an irreconcilable difference." But of course, if you've worked with eyewitness accounts, you're going to realize there's a certain bandwidth here of differences you're going to see between people's accounts just because people perceive things differently in the moment and they have a different set of priorities. The same way, how can I give you a good
Yeah.
analogy on this? We
You.
have like a tunnel vision, right? We
Yeah.
will look, if you have an interest in a certain feature in nature, you like certain kinds of trees, you'll see them all over the place. Other people will not see them at all
Yeah.
because you have an interest they don't have. So the same
I
kind of thing happens in eyewitness accounts.
I think you bring up that point in the God's Not Dead film on how this is actually our
Mhm.
strength and not our weakness. Because, critics will try to attack the Gospels and say, oh, well, the Gospels contradict or the
Mhm.
accounts of the resurrection
Yeah.
contradict and so forth. There's discrepancy. And I think it was in that film, you obviously in your writings too, but you bring forward, no, this is actually our strength from my expertise in crime. Yeah.
Right. Because I think that in the end, the question becomes, do you think that the assemblers of the New Testament did not see these differences? Do you think the people in the first century who were collecting these manuscripts, who were using them in the local churches, using them in local congregations, do you think they didn't see that John seems to be a little bit different than Mark in
Yeah.
the way he records something? Of course they did. Now they had ample time to smooth out those differences, yet they didn't. And I'm glad they didn't because these are exactly the kind of level of variation. That's what got me interested. The
Yeah.
fact that they didn't match. I'm like, whoa, yeah, and here's what's really interesting about eyewitness accounts. Now, this has been called undesigned coincidences by J.J. Blunt, who a scholar from I think the 19th century, who noticed he called them undesigned coincidences. I don't like that expression so much. I call them unintentional eyewitness support. I wouldn't say that every undesigned coincidence that Blunt would identify to
Mhm.
me was interesting. What's only interesting to me is when an eyewitness says something and you're like scratching your head. Like why would that be? Why would he say it that way?
Yeah.
And it's not really clear until you have the other eyewitness accounts and you realize, oh, okay, this is described more fully over here. And this person apparently is aware they saw the same thing, but
Yeah.
they didn't explain it fully. But now the two accounts together form a puzzle piece in which a question raised by one witness is actually answered by the other. And this one's not making an effort. He's not saying, and by the way, she didn't say this, so let me add this. No, she's just doing her own thing and unintentionally supports the other person who's mentioned something else. So you see this throughout the Gospels. I mean, it's just, it's remarkable. And I've tried to highlight some of them in Cold Case Christianity, but that's exactly the texture of eyewitness accounts. And so that a couple of a bunch of other things. It's those four criteria, right? It's,
Yeah.
were they written early enough to be eyewitness accounts? Do they have some corroboration? Have they changed their story over time? And do they have a reason to lie to me? Those were the things I was examining.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that. In the earlier chapters of Cold Case Christianity, you
Mhm.
talked about how we can have these presuppositions that hinder
Mhm.
us from embracing the truth of Christianity, particularly naturalism. Um, how else have you seen? How else would you explain how presuppositions can hinder us from embracing the truth, or can you unpack that statement a little bit?
Well, it may not even be something about the reliability of scripture or just
Yeah.
your first decision about whether or not Christianity is true. It might just be that you have some philosophical position related to theology.
Yeah.
And it's because you were raised this way. Maybe you were raised in a denomination that holds a certain position. And because that's the way you were raised, and you always associated this with like true Christianity, because that was the way you were raised, that if somebody shows you something in scripture that is actually supports the other theological position, you might just reject it outright because you have a presuppositional bias. It's like
Yeah.
you really haven't examined it maybe necessarily or thought deeply about all the connectivity of scripture. But because you've always been taught this way, you hold that bias. This was, and everyone holds a presuppositional position on every topic.
Yeah.
So it's okay because if you're looking, for example, for jurors who don't have biases,
Yeah.
don't have got preconceived notions, good luck. You're not going to be able to impanel a jury. What we have to be able to do is say, okay, do you recognize it? Are you able to set it aside? Is
Hmm.
it or is it the kind of thing that's so such an obstruction that there's no way you could be fair in this case? Totally get it. If there
Yeah.
are people who have bad experiences with police officers, for example, and there's no way they can be put on a panel because they just assume from the get-go, if you're wearing a uniform, you're lying. And there's
Hmm.
people who have the opposite of you. Well, if you're wearing a red jumpsuit because you're in the county jail, you must be guilty of something. Well, we have to kind of make sure there aren't people with those presuppositions to begin with. And here, my presupposition was simply that I didn't believe in anything miraculous.
Yeah.
I didn't see any reason to believe in anything miraculous. Although, I think if I had thought more deeply about it, there are some things that just cannot be explained with space-time matter, physics, and chemistry. And it's like the fact that we're thinking about things freely right now with our immaterial minds, that there has to be some place in your worldview that embraces the notion that not everything may be just subject to space-time matter, physics, and chemistry. And if you'll open your mind to that, then at least the question only becomes is this the legitimate expression of that potentially supernatural aspect of the world, or is it not? So, but worse than that, if you're saying if the whole investigation is could anything supernatural occur, like a resurrection, you certainly can't begin by saying, well, no, nothing supernatural occurs. No, that's the investigation you're after. That's the thing
Right.
you're investigating. Is the supernatural explanation the most reasonable inference? But if you're starting off with, no, no, there's no reasonable inference that's supernatural, that you can't even start the investigation. And that's my whole point, is that you have to at least table that. Have an open hand about your presuppositional biases, and let's see if the case is strong enough to hold its own weight.
Awesome. Yeah. You kind of touched on this in in an earlier answer, but I wanted to be specific with it
Mhm.
because critics will attack the dating of the Gospels. They'll
Mhm.
try to put
Mhm.
them on the in or downgrade them the same validity as the Gnostic Gospels, or they'll try to say, oh, well, this came after the destruction of Jerusalem, of course, is prophesied, or they might attack the dating of the Gospels and say that these were all just put together, the canon, and some far later council. But you
Mhm.
came to the conclusion that you agree with the earlier dating of the Gospels. Why is that relevant to the claims of Christianity?
Because it's so easy. So if you wanted to lie about Jesus, one of the Best strategies you might take is simply to wait till everyone knows the truth is dead. Then you can say whatever you want about Jesus. So the later, and of course they know this, the skeptics knows that's why they'll always claim that it's late. They
Mhm.
realize that the earlier it is, the more reliable it could be.
Yeah.
So they always want to push it back. Now, what causes this pushback? And people will usually try to date it post 70 AD. And they're dating it post 70 AD because a really really tragic
Yeah.
and an important event occurred.
Yeah.
The destruction of the Jerusalem, both the city and the temple, much of the city and the temple, by the Romans who were putting down the Jewish uprising. Okay, so that was preceded by a 2 or 3 year siege of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And the question becomes, did this, and one of the reasons why that becomes a linchpin, a turning point, is that Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
And so if you're somebody who holds a presuppositional bias toward naturalism, then you're going to reject not only miracles, but anything miraculous like a prophecy, like an accurate prophecy. Those are just coincidences. So if you've got someone who's accurately predicting something that then happens in history, your inclination is going to be, well, it must have been written after the event, because then you're not really predicting it. You're simply reporting it as if it's a prediction. So I've talked to Daniel Wallace about this, who's not related to me, but a pretty well-versed scholar in all the original languages. He's
Yeah.
got a great ministry out of Dallas. Um, just to ask him, look, you've looked at so much manuscript evidence. Tell me, is there something that's really based on manuscript evidence that confirms for us this is post 70 AD? Or is this just a bias about supernatural events?
Mhm.
Because that means you're not only going to you're going to say it's late because no living person would affirm a miracle. So therefore, you have to wait until everyone's dead before you can write about it. And you've got a prophecy about the temple that was met. So therefore, people put it post 70. Now, I think that's really just based on a bias against the supernatural. There's so many reasons. There's no mention, for example, of things that you would have mentioned, it seems to me, if because they were important. The death of Peter,
Yeah.
not mentioned. By the way, if you're Luke and you want to say something about this prophecy and make a big deal of it, then wouldn't you report the destruction of the temple? That's the very thing in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus predicts. Wouldn't you in the book of Acts then just report it so that you can kind of connect the dots? It's missing from the book of Acts, along with the death of Peter, the death of Paul, the death of Barnabas, the death of James, the brother of Jesus, even though he's mentioning the death of James, the brother of John in
Yeah.
44. Why would you leave out these deaths in the 60s of these key players who have take up so much ink in the gospel in the book of Acts? Barnabas, James, James, Peter, and Paul. Who else gets more ink than those four? And
Mhm.
yet no death of those four is ever mentioned. Not only that, but if you look at the gospels, you'll see that they report events as if they are still true. Like, for example, Sadducees and Pharisees, all of these groups of Jews that were so influential, but ceased to be influential like that post destruction of the temple, post destruction of Jerusalem. They're only important up to that point. Yet
Right.
these are the main characters in the Gospels that are
Mhm.
recorded as if this is still true, as if these people still have power. You talk about the pool of Bethesda at the sheep gate
Yeah.
in John, I think it's John 5. That's a pool that is described as still being there. There is a pool by the
Right.
sheep gate called
To this
Bethesda.
day. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's not there was a pool. These
Yeah.
are the things that won't exist post 70, and they're reported as though they are pre 70. There's lots of reasons to believe this is a pre 70. And you'll see that Luke is quoted by Paul several times. The Gospel of Luke is quoted by Paul in First Corinthians, it's quoted by Paul in First Timothy, as if he's got access to it. And it's even, he considers it so influential that he's willing to report it to Timothy and report it to the church in Corinth when he's trying to correct them from something he taught them in the like 50, 51.
Yeah.
And now by 53, 54, he's having to correct them using Luke's gospel to correct them on the Lord's Supper. So I just think that we've got good reason to believe that Luke's gospel, that all these gospels are written early enough within the lifetime of eyewitnesses that would actually support the early dating. And does that mean they're true? No. It doesn't mean they're true. It just means that they're written early, and that's one of the pieces in the cumulative case you're going to have to lock down if you even ever hope to infer that they're true.
Yeah. Thank you. You mentioned prophecy there, so this is a little bit more of a person of interest question.
Hmm.
Because when reading person of interest, you talk about how you had this experience where you were checking with the pastor, and you referred to these as cloaked prophecies. Essentially, you weren't that convinced that
No.
these were even talking about a Messiah, but then you said
Right.
you narrowed it down to about four. Obviously, you could see in hindsight, but you eventually come to see that, but you narrowed it down to, I want to say, four prophets that were seemed irrefutable to you, that these are clearly prophesying about Jesus of Nazareth. Can you tell us why those four were so convincing to you?
Well, so for me, the issue becomes um, I was just never impressed by prophecy. I just never
Yeah.
was. I felt like if you read the text that somebody is quoting and their message about prophecies, you could read that text. And I'm thinking, well, I don't think the earliest Jewish readers who read these texts thought this was even necessarily messianic. For me, I really struggled with the prophecies as now, is it part of an overarching cumulative case? I think it is.
Yeah.
But just I'm telling you, the first couple of years looking at these things, I was never that impressed. But you had to really kind of assess them and think of them in terms of how, okay, so in criminal trials, when you're doing an investigation, often we have informants, and the informants that are reliable, legally called reliable, confidential, reliable informants, CRIs,
Hmm.
those are confidential and reliable because number one, they haven't given up their identity to anybody else, and two, they've already given me some piece of data that I can document that was true. Once they've given me some piece of data, that they're like in a different status now because they
Yeah.
are reliable. They've already said something that I know is true. So now when I put their next piece of information in my search warrant, that piece of information is considered reliable because it comes from the CRI.
Hmm.
Okay, so what would make somebody reliable? I looked at all the prophecies. I'm looking at those prophets who made predictions related to history.
Okay.
Yes, they're going to make predictions related to the Messiah. But if you made a prediction related to history, and then that prediction comes true, I think you're in a different category. Now, there are prophets who made no predictions to about history, and they may also be reliable, but I could never demonstrate that using this
Hmm.
standard of were you right about something else? Because if you're right about something else, then I might be able to trust you for the next thing.
Yeah.
So for me, I was looking at those prophets who had made claims about history. And so and these are going to separate out some of these folks from others. So here's what I would say. When I make a cumulative case, there's lots of pieces of evidence I could bring in front of a jury that I don't bring in. I don't think they're strong enough. Do I think they
Yeah.
actually lean in my direction? Yeah.
Yeah.
But do I need them really? No. I'm just going to use what I think is enough to make the case that is strong. Now, if the other team, the defense team, wants to bring up those other things, great. We'll show you how they also fit in our case. We just don't bring in weak stuff because we don't think that weak stuff helps us.
Hmm.
So if you were just going to, for the sake of argument, say, I'm only going to use the prophecies that are written by prophets who also predicted the future in history, so I would consider them reliable in some way.
I see.
Well, then you make a really strong case. And by the way, you can make a very strong case from prophecy. And that's what I try to do in this book. Also, I'm looking at timelines in the book, Person of Interest. And I think it's interesting. Like, why doesn't Jesus come until he does? Well, one of the reasons why he doesn't come until he does is because the prophecies are so limited. The earliest prophecies are in the book of Genesis. And
Yeah.
if you look at the prophecies about the Messiah, you won't get clarity in all of the investigative what, why, when, how, where, and who. You won't get those six answers really until the end of the closing canon of the Old Testament. So when you get to Malachi, you have enough information that now, if this guy shows up and he meets all of those descriptions, you ought to recognize him. And so I just kind of show over the course of history how the questions to the answers start to emerge in prophecy. And you can just use the CRIs if you want, those who have already made predictions, and you'll end up, I think, with pretty strong. Remember, there's two ways of looking at crime scene evidence. Some evidence is the kind of evidence that when you find it in a crime scene, like DNA, you know it's already telling me who the suspect is. I have to find the guy whose DNA matches this. It might even be in a database.
Hmm.
But this evidence in the crime scene right now is going to show me who it is. I'm just going to go knock on his door and I'm going to know that it's him because I had the evidence. It pointed to him in advance. Other evidence I find in the crime scene only makes sense in hindsight. So if I have a button and I pick up the button from the crime scene, and then I go knock on this guy's door, I don't even know if it's him or not, the right guy
Yeah,
or not, but I knock on his door and I discover he's got a shirt missing the button. Well, now the button also helps me make the case, but it points to something in the past. In other words, one thing tells me who it is before I speak to him. The other thing only tells me it's him after I speak to him.
I see.
Prophecies are the same way.
Yeah.
Some point clearly, some only make sense when looking backwards. They're like buttons. Once I get the guy in sight, I go, oh, do you realize he matches this piece of evidence? And those are legitimate in front of a jury. Both
Mhm.
kinds of evidence are legitimate. The kind that clearly points in advance, the kind that shows you something afterwards. Those two kinds of evidence we talk about, and we break all of the prophecies into those two groups. So I think if you're somebody who loves prophecy, that book is going to give you a new way to think about prophecies, how they unwrap in the timeline, how to use the reliable CRIs, and how to look at those two ways that we use evidence at crime scenes to point to a suspect.
Awesome. And you use the term motive. So in Cold Case Christianity, you show how motive is generally rooted in either to commit a crime. Motive is either rooted in greed, sex, or power. I believe were
Mhm.
the three that you mentioned. So can you explain to our listener why the apostles were not motivated by any of those factors to make up the claims of the Gospels?
Okay, well, there's a fourth motive. If you, I look at the motives as the ones we could actually go to court with.
Okay.
So if you said, hey, somebody is criminally insane, well, I can't try somebody who's been deemed criminally insane.
Ah,
So that's a different kind of that's not a motive. That takes him off my. But here's the problem: that very few people are actually criminally insane. Sane people do crazy things. It's just the way it is. I mean, all of
yeah,
us in a moment could do anything, and that's why that's a whole nother. That's the truth and true crime book, because the reality of it is that every one of us is capable of doing something evil.
yeah,
So if for those who I could go to court with, there's only three motives: financial greed, sexual lust, pursuit of power. Pursuit of power is probably 70% of all stupid things because sometimes it's just that I feel like, hey, my position's being threatened. You disrespected me. I want this thing that's not for sex or money. I just want it because it makes me look good. Anything that's about privilege, it's about celebrity, it's about pride. Now, all of those three happen to stand on that platform of pride. I
yeah,
want what I want. But there is no fourth category. People will always write to me and say, well, you're not thinking about, for example, jealousy. Well, what are you jealous about? Go back a layer and you're at those three doorsteps again. What are you vengeful about? It's going to be one of those three things. So what motivates us is and you see this I've never worked a crime in which there was a fourth motive. It's
yeah,
always one of those three. And that's helpful because it's not just the three motives for murder. Those are the three motives for any misbehavior.
yeah,
Any misbehavior. And lying is a misbehavior. So if you're wondering what would cause someone to lie, it's the same three motives that cause all misbehavior. People lie for sex, money, and power.
yeah,
By the way, that's a biblical concept because it's in First John 2. So it's not as though we don't. I didn't know it was a biblical concept until because I was looking at these for almost a decade before I became a Christian,
hmm
as a detective, and so I just discovered them by if you work enough murders, and you've seen enough stuff, you realize this is what causes it. If you really look at our detective division, I could take every subunit in our detective division, and it's going to be locked into one of those three motives.
yeah,
Anyway, the point is, so I didn't really know this any other way except for through experience. But the disciples, if they're lying because of sex, money, or power. So the question you have to ask is, what did they get out of it in terms of sexual relationships? Is that what? And also, if you're thinking, well, you're just crazy. Crazy is easy to explain when it's one person.
okay,
Collective crazy is a lot harder to explain. And the number of people here who are making the claim is not just limited to the 12, although we often think of it that way. There are 120 people in the upper room in Acts 1, and it didn't take very much time to replace Judas. Why? Because there were lots of other eyewitnesses who were already ready to step into those shoes, who, according to Peter, had seen the risen Christ and had seen Jesus from the time of the baptism all the way to the resurrection. So there was a candidate pool that was much larger than the 12. And Paul says there were 500 people who saw the risen Christ on the same day. So when you see that, you got to ask yourself, what's driving these people?
yeah,
It's only one of three things. So I have seen, and by the way, I think skeptics know this. Some of the best skeptics, who I think are smart people. By the way, that's one thing I don't. I've never my approach, and I try to make sure I don't let people on my social media platforms who are Christians berate non-believers as if they're
Yeah.
foolish. Yes, you could say that Scripture tells us the foolishness of rejecting the notion of God.
Yeah.
But I think the pejorative of just going to name calling and saying, well, you're an idiot. The people who I see who are skeptics who are writing and written books are not idiots at all, which is, I think, part of the problem. It turns out that when you think you know the answer, you're not willing to listen to anybody else's version of it. So what I see is some of these skeptics will argue not that they're driven by money or driven by sex, because I think historically there's no way to make that case. But they'll say they're driven by power
Mm.
because the power would simply be, and power is nuanced. It could just be a position. When we do a YouTube video,
Yeah.
we have a platform. And the
Yeah.
larger our platform becomes, the better we feel about it. And that becomes the thing then that might cause us to do something we shouldn't do,
Mm.
right? To cut a corner or just, why?
Yeah.
Because we want more views on our videos. You can't take that approach because then you're submitting to the third thing, which is power. So is it Paul then? So Paul writes most of the New Testament. Do we really think he's not driven by sex? He's not driven by money. Do we think he's driven by power? This is a guy who had the opportunity to be in a much higher role in Judaism under one of the best Jewish teachers of his day, who had enough power at the point this all started to draw papers to execute Christians. So you're telling me that one day he decides, I'm just going to jump out of this position of power, authority, and respect I have in this Jewish community, and I'm going to jump in with these Christians who don't have any of that, and then get my rear end kicked all over the planet for the next 30 years, hoping to someday return to the position I already have
Hmm.
with the larger group.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it now again, that is possible.
Yeah.
And every explanation is possible. I never deny the possibility of an explanation, but it's not reasonable. And that's what I'm after. I'm not after what's possible. I'm after what's reasonable. And although it's possible that Paul did all that because he thought somehow he was going to get famous and powerful, I don't think that's a reasonable answer. And I think if you really were looking at this, you know, honestly, you would have to admit that's not a reasonable answer for Paul. And Paul wrote most of the New Testament. In the end, what happened to these people because of their claims, they didn't even have the power to stop their own deaths, most of them.
Yeah.
So I just don't see this as a reasonable explanation for why they would lie about this. And again, if you're going to lie about this, well, then you're going to see that you're going to have a long-term problem. It'd be far better for there to be one gospel that everyone can just clamor to and say, here it is. But when you look at all these gospels and somehow we're able to put all of these, puzzle these all together, that's a much more difficult task historically. So I just think there's better reason to believe. But again, that would be asking someone to believe something supernatural,
Yeah.
that a man rose from the grave. Forget about the miracles. It's all hinging on the resurrection. And that's a big ask for a lot of people. I get it.
Yeah. Yeah, great explanation of that. Understanding the motive behind the apostles' writings and so forth, and why they would go to martyrdom for these claims.
Right.
In Christianity, you talked about with just the outside writings of historians of the first century, whether we're talking Josephus or Tacitus, that we could piece together the main claims of Christianity, of Jesus' birth, ministry, death, resurrection. And then in Person of Interest, you go on to talk about how this we could also do this with art and music and pop culture. Why does that strengthen the case of Christianity?
Okay, so, and I remember when I wrote Person of Interest, I had fellow apologists who would call me and say, I think this is not the way we should go. We should
Hmm.
not make a case this way. And it's because they've never made cumulative cases in front of a jury. So,
Yeah.
what counts as evidence is everything. Everything has the potential to be added to the case. So, what's in the crime scene could become part of the case. What's missing from the crime scene? That could also become part of the case. What should be there but wasn't? That could also be part of the case. What did he say?
Hmm.
That's probably part of the case. What should he have said, but he failed to say it or intentionally didn't say it? That's going to be part of the case. It's the yin and yang. Every little thing has the potential to be used as evidence. And one of those things is that if Jesus is who he said he was, shouldn't we have seen an impact on culture unlike any other person on planet Earth.
Yeah.
I mean, if he's the God of the universe who steps back into his culture, do you really think that all we're going to see are four little gospels and we're just going to be pushing this thing, pushing this thing? No, he should have had the impact that no other person had. So when I try to do in person of interest is show that nobody has impacted art, music, literature, science, education, and world religions
Yeah.
like Jesus of Nazareth. Those five categories, which are, by the way, the five things that I, as an atheist, would have said gave meaning to culture. Cultures that express, that flourish in the literature, arts, music, science, education, those are the things that make a good culture. Well, nobody has had more impact on those five areas than Jesus of Nazareth. And we take it for granted because we are swimming in an ocean and don't even realize that we're wet because we're constantly in the same ocean. And it's an ocean that was created by Jesus and his followers. And so I wanted to show that. And at the end of the book, what I'm trying to say is, hey, so think about this as the thought experiment.
Yeah.
Can you imagine a fictional character who could have had this kind of impact on art, literature, music, education, science, and world relations? Think of one. Who is it? Okay, you won't think of one. Can you think of a real human being who has had this kind of impact on art? And people think, oh, yeah, I got somebody. Well, tell me who it is. No one's been painted more. Every single genre of, and it's not just in the West,
Hmm.
globally. And I provide evidence of that. No one's had the impact on science and its thinking other than Jesus and his followers. I can show you that Christianity became the catalyst for modern science. More science fathers are Christians than any other group, every other group combined. But nobody talks about it. I want to give you a list of everyone from modern chemistry to quantum mechanics. I want to give you all of it so you can see these were all believers who believe things that, and they wrote about these things in their own personal notes, in their own letters to family members, in books. And if you just assembled what the science fathers had to say about Jesus of Nazareth, if you didn't have a single Christian document, you could reconstruct the story of Jesus from the writings of the science fathers. So this is the kind of impact that Jesus and his followers had on the world. And if you can't think of a fictional character, then there's good reason to believe he's not fiction. This actually speaks to the historicity of Jesus. And if you
Yeah.
can't think of a human being who's had this kind of impact, well, there's good reason to believe he's not human.
Hmm.
So I think the fact that he's neither of those two categories, man, myth, or Messiah, Messiah is a better inference than
Yeah.
man or myth, because I can't think of a man or a myth that has ever had, and we've had thousands of years of humans in which to find another example. Well, tell me who that is. So I do think in the end that this impact that we have, that Jesus had, is an evidence. It's just another piece. And so, I'll just tell you how this book emerged. This book
Yeah.
emerged because I was just starting with Zondervan Publishers, and I had been with David C. Cook for years. And Zondervan said, "Hey, what are your ideas for books?" And I've got a couple I want to write. I really wanted to write The Truth and True Crime. To me, even before I wrote Cold Case Christianity, I was no longer interested in that case. That's the stuff I had to go through to become a Christian.
Hmm.
By the time I started writing books, I've been a Christian for, 15 years.
Yeah.
So I was interested in writing the things that I thought helped me live a life of submission to Jesus. That's the stuff in The Truth and True Crime. I think it has apologetics value also, but that's what I was really, but everybody wants to know the forensic side of it. And when I
Yeah.
went to Zondervan, they said, "Hey, what's your idea for a book?" And I said, "I want to do The Truth and True Crime." And they said, "No, we want another Jesus book. We want something like Cold Case Christianity over here."
Yeah.
And I said, well, to be honest, there's only one small area. I call it fuse and fallout. If you read the book, you know what I'm
Yeah.
talking
I was
about.
about to ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So just the idea that anytime you don't know what happened in a crime scene, you can examine the fuse that led up to that detonation of that terrible day, and then all the fallout that occurred after the terrible day. And you can discover what kind of bomb you're dealing with just by looking at the fuse and the fallout. Same thing with the first century with Jesus. If you didn't know who or what Jesus was or why we call it the first century, you could examine the fuse and the fallout of history and discover that it's Jesus that changed everything. Okay, so that had always been a kind of, but to be honest, I really wanted to write The Truth and True Crime.
Yeah.
And so I had to write Person of Interest in order to get to the opportunity to write The Truth
Huh.
and True Crime. So, but it happened to be the COVID year, and all
Yeah.
of our speaking engagements got canceled, so I could put in the deep research. Also, I asked the publisher, look, often I discover I write a book and then I go speak about it. And the kind of visual presentation I give to a jury,
Hmm.
I create for each book. And then afterwards, I go, dang, I wish I would have written this closer to what I think is more powerful visually.
Yeah.
So this book, I asked the publisher, let me do the visual presentations first. It'll take me about a year. And after I do all of the visual presentations, I'll write the book from the visual presentations. And that's why that book has over 400 illustrations. That's just me thinking about it visually so that the case seems a little clearer because I think we are a visual, we're in a visual culture.
Yeah.
And so I want to, and I have an art degree, so I really wanted to scratch that itch.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think that's what stood out to me in Person of Interest. It's very comprehensive. And I thought the concept of the fuse and the fallout just really stood out to me like nothing I'd heard before. Like, wow, that makes so much sense, you know?
Well, and part of it too is that, and I don't think that every, like there's people who are very, very gifted historians, and I respect that. I think that what here, what we have to do is we have to teach history to a group of 12 people and convince them that this actually happened in history, this thing we think happened. So it's kind of like you're doing history, but you're doing it with a group that's going to tell you if you're doing it well or not. And
Yeah.
so the pressure's on, right? Like we have to make this case, not just in a book, we have to make the case in front of a jury, and then we have to see if the jury will agree and render a verdict. And so that process, that back and forth process does teach you something about, well, do you think you really have a case? Is this a case you could make in front of a jury? So that's just kind of the way you think all the time. Like, for example, I'm not going to knock on that guy's door in a cold case.
Yeah.
To me, when I knock on his door for that first interview, he's already arrestable. I've spent probably like 8 years working this case.
Yeah.
He doesn't know I've spent 8 years working it. But now I'm about to start this now I'm about to push over the first domino by knocking on his door. But I already have the case assembled. The search warrant's already written. It's in my hand. He doesn't know it, but I'll knock on that door for the first interview. And if he talks to me, great. If he doesn't, here's the search warrant. We're coming in anyway.
Yeah.
And the reality of it is that the same thing here. We want to be able to build a case in our mind for whether or not Christianity is true before we have any conversation with anybody. What I think is interesting is that we don't often think of it that way as Christians. We kind of think our experience is good enough.
Hmm.
I've had an experience, just let me tell you about my experience. But it turns out that everyone's had an experience. I've got Mormon family members
Yeah.
that have great testimonies. Their testimony does not make Mormonism true. So
Yeah.
it's important for us to be able to test what we think we've experienced.
Yeah. As you were explaining that, you mentioned how Jesus affected religion as well, like religions, plural. And it's interesting because critics will often attack Christianity and say, "Oh, well, this copied this," like, "Oh, this copied the what's the Sumerian thing?" Or they'll say, "Oh, well, Jesus
Like
copied
like
the
Mithras or
Mithras, or
yes, yeah,
yeah,"
yeah,
and they'll say, "Oh, well, the claims of Jesus just copied this other religion."
right.
But the way you explain it in Person of Interest, you actually show these similarities as a strength of Christianity.
Yes.
Can you articulate that to our listener?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, in the end, expectations determine outcomes. They
Yeah.
just do. So I offer an example of a case in which I was working undercover, and we had a burglary, and I wanted to jump the call. The patrol officer was coming to talk to the victim. I wanted to jump it because we were working that neighborhood, and we thought, hey, maybe we can still catch these guys before they leave the neighborhood. So I'm going to jump this call, talk to the victim, and get a better description of the
Mm.
car, get a better description of the suspects before the police officer gets there, the uniformed police officer gets there. Well, that guy wouldn't even help me at all. That victim wouldn't even talk to me because his expectations were he just called the police. He's going to get a uniformed police officer. This guy jumps out of the car. My hair was down to the middle of my back. I'm wearing shorts. I'm working undercover for 4 years. So I don't look like a cop. And he would
Yeah.
not help me until the cop got there. And he's like, oh, okay. And then he talks to the cop. Okay. Expectations determine outcomes.
Yeah.
The same is true with any kind of set of views. Yes, if you think deeply, if you don't know anything about any religion, any world religion, but you think, I suspect there's a creator. And I asked you, okay, well, tell me, what do you think he's like? Like, what kind of power does he have? Well, you're going to come up with an explanation that's going to be pretty much similar to what all people think about if they imagine there's a God.
Yeah.
because they have an expectation. They think, yeah, I can't explain some of these things. If there's a God, he's going to be powerful. Okay.
Hmm.
He's going to be able to work supernatural miracles. Okay. All gods do that. He's going to be probably have a pretty supernatural origin story. I mean, even Marvel characters kind of do this all the time too.
Yeah.
So if you were to take a look at all of the similarities between every view of God historically, you're going to find there's a you could make 30 if you want, but you'll find there are 15 that are pretty robust. That they don't appear like some will have six of these 15. Some of these theistic worldviews will have, 10 is probably the most, and they won't have the same 10. They'll have different combinations of the 15 that I identify in this book. And we did that by reading through all of the mythologies. So if you look at Christianity, it turns out what's really interesting is that I put them all in timeline. So you can see them as they emerge and which of the 15 attributes each theistic system has. And and then you're going to get to the very end and there's going to be Jesus. And it turns out Jesus is the only one of all of these systems that has all 15 attributes.
Hmm.
Everyone else kind of cuts the pizza in a different way and has different pieces of the pizza in it. Only Jesus is the full pizza.
Hmm.
And it's because Jesus comes and he meets the expectations of everyone who had been thinking previously about God. And this is what Paul is talking about on Mars Hill. You people are super religious. You've even got an idol to an unknown God. Well, I'm here to tell you about the God you've imagined.
Hmm.
You're right in some places and you're wrong in others.
Yeah.
So let me tell you, we actually saw him. Let me tell you about him. So that's the thing that happens. And of course, yeah, people have been thinking about God since there have been people.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, isn't it? And when they aren't thinking about and applying these values to God, they're applying them to things in their secular world. We all worship. The only question is, what do we worship?
Yeah.
And who do we worship? So I think this is a strength. This is exact. And then when Jesus comes, he meets everyone's expectations, which is one of the reasons why I think Christianity exploded like it did. Is that if you were somebody who was confused about God, but you had a couple of these attributes you've been ruminating about,
Yeah.
well, it turns out Jesus possesses those attributes, plus a lot more you hadn't been thinking about.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing, the power of the Jesus story. And C.S. Lewis puts it this way: all those other stories were the myths of men. Not to say that he uses the word myth to mean a story about deity,
Yeah.
not fiction. He would argue that Jesus is God's myth, God's story about deity. Those came from the minds of men who are imagining. This comes from the truth of God. And so that's why you see the difference here.
Well explained. You have time for one more question?
Yeah, I do.
Good, good. In Person of Interest, you quote, I believe it's Galatians 4:4. God sent his son in the fullness of time. Some might say Person of Interest is the biggest commentary on Galatians 6, 4:4. And you talked about, so I've actually heard someone ask in a small group, like, well, why didn't God send Jesus at some other time? And you talk about the specifics of the Pax Romana, like that
Yes.
Jesus had to come during this time. And then you talk about the tolerance fuse. Can you talk about if Jesus had not come at this exact time, how that would have affected things, how that would have had an impact of there not being the Pax Romana, there
Right.
not being that tolerance during that time period.
Well,
Uh,
here's what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is
yeah,
that there are a number of human events directed by humans that orchestrated a perfect time for Jesus to come. No, these are all divinely orchestrated truths
yeah,
that line up at a certain time. And I think that they're provided for us so we can go back and go, wow, who other
yeah,
than God? Who other than God could actually line this up?
Providence.
And I think there are three strands of the fuse that lead up to this. The first one is prophetic, that
Yeah,
by the time we get to this, and you know that Jesus is going to come, that the Messiah is going to come, according to Daniel,
mhm,
sometime between the restoration of the temple, restoration of Jerusalem, and the destruction of the temple, because it's going to actually be able to walk into the temple. The Messiah, there'll be a temple in which he could walk, he could enter.
yeah,
So you have a very, very, strict period of time here that begins, several centuries before the Common Era. I'll just call it the Common Era for now. I would, of course, today call it AD.
yeah,
But and then it's going to be about 70, destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So you got this window in which, if that prophecy is true, It has to occur in that window. But you also have a perfect cultural storm in which you have the invention of the kind of writing instruments and material that could circulate the story, a peacetime economy in which you can invest in roads so that people like Paul can walk all over the empire and spread
Yeah.
the message. You've got a number of things that open up a window opportunity for you to. And by the way, that Pax Romana, it ends at some point, and then all that investment of money is put in different places, and things are start to get destroyed again in wars. So you have that cultural fuse as well. And finally you have this spiritual fuse, which is the fact that if I wanted to come and meet the expectations of every prior thinking about God, every prior theistic worldview, well, those worldviews came and faded over time.
Yeah.
Egyptian, Persian, all these gods and deities, they're only worshipped in certain periods of time. So I kind of do a red zone where I overlap the window that's prophetic, the window that's cultural, and the window that's spiritual. And you're going to find it puts you right there at the ministry of Jesus. And that to me was something that when I discovered that red zone, we use red zones also when we do criminal trials. It was mind blowing for me. And I talk about this on all kinds of videos on YouTube. And I can tell you, I get this all the time. Why are you using BCE and CE? Why do you use that language? Well, because when I tell the story, I
Yeah.
tell it as part of my progression from atheism to Christianity. Yes, of course, I would today call it BC and AD. But
Yeah.
back when I was investigating these things, I called it BCE and CE. It was the common era. And I
Yeah.
think if I'm trying to reach people who are like me, that's what they would probably still call it. But it
Hmm.
turns out that that common era is called the common era because somebody came, and because of that person coming, we are calling that century the first century, even though it isn't the first century. There are many centuries before the first
Yeah.
century. What is the explosion? It's Jesus. And I don't know who else could do this and have that kind of impact that's fiction or that's just another man. So in the end, I think that's the power of this is that it demonstrates that only somebody, if this is God incarnate,
Yeah.
entering back into his creation, this is exactly the kind of impact I would expect him to have. Let me just say one last thing. You mentioned in a Bible study that people will say, wouldn't it be a better time to come? I get this all the time. Now is the
Yeah.
time to come. Now is the time to come because you've got all of this technology that can get this out.
Yeah.
This would be the worst time to come because I don't think any of us anymore believes anything we're seeing.
Yeah.
We don't.
I don't
I
know if
mean,
it's AI or if
yeah,
it's
if you
not he
watch,
said it. I don't know.
yeah, to watch TikTok, go through your stream. Tell me what can you trust in any of that anymore?
Yeah.
So I think that right, and not only that, where it's polarized, the best time to come is in that red zone that I describe in Person of Interest, because I think you had an impact to change the known world and set the course of human history, so that you could even look back 2,000 years later and go, wow, who else but God alone could have done that? Now we have the perspective. If Jesus came, he would just be another person we would doubt.
Hmm.
And so I think the kinds of things he did, and that God knew exactly what he was doing. And I think this is part of a larger plan. In other words, every story, if you think about it, it has that ascending action and that climatic moment, and then that descending action toward the end of the book. And I think what we're right now, we are somewhere in that storyline, God's storyline. And everything that we're seeing post Jesus is just part of God's story. I think we had this expectation that when Jesus came the first time, it should have just ended.
Hmm.
No, no, this is part of the story. And you
Yeah.
might ask, well, why is there suffering in this part of the story? Well, what story have you ever written in which there wasn't the challenge that's overcome?
Yeah.
It's part of the descending action. It's part of the climactic moment. It's part of the thing that you have to know what chapter you're in. And so we often experience something terrible and we think that that chapter we're in is the last chapter. But if Christianity is true, there are an infinite number of chapters in eternity. And we cannot continually look at the chapter we're in as though it's the last chapter. Like we have to figure out our story is just part of God's larger overarching story. And we have to be patient with that. Just it'd be like reading the book and getting to that moment of terror, that moment of challenge, and just closing the book. I'm done.
Yeah.
Don't you want to see how it turns out? Of course you do. Well, we have an opportunity as Christians to see how it turns out. We have to be patient.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You know,
So yeah, I got to enjoy earlier this month, Truth and True Crime. Reminded me of when you're in scripture and you're in the wisdom literature. It seemed like you had your experience in one hand and your biblical worldview in the other, and just inciting wisdom to the reader. So thank you for that. Your books have been equipping and edifying and a real blessing to me as a fellow apologist. So before we close out here, would you mind just telling our listener how they could uh, support your ministry or any other new projects that you have coming forth in the near future?
right. So I always tell people, we're not a 501(c)(3. We're not a ministry really. We're just a guy who got saved and then didn't want to shut up about it. And I think that's probably a lot of us.
Yeah, yeah,
And so we don't have a team. It's just a guy in an office
yeah,
who feels like this is the thing I'm called to do right now.
yeah.
So what I always say, if you want to help us, is just visit and read and become the best case maker you can become, because
Okay.
we don't need another $1 million apologist. I say this all the time. We need $1 million apologists.
Hmm.
We need all of us to to take a bite out of that apple. It may not be the biggest bite you'd like, but everyone can bite it. And we need to do this if we're going to have an impact on culture. Look, there's already things. You're in the middle of the playoffs, the football playoffs and college playoffs, and everyone can make a case for why they think this or that. We're talking about stuff. The
Yeah.
question is, what are we talking about? And we are making a case for something. The question is, what are we making a case for? And I think I could argue that whatever it is you worship, that's the thing you can defend. That's the thing you find yourself defending all the time. So
Yeah.
the question is, ask yourself, what is it you're best equipped to defend? You just found your idol.
Hmm.
So I think for us, we have to say, hey, can we defend this? Our work is at coldcasechristianity.com. Tons of articles. It's all there. I always tell people, don't buy anything from an author until you've exhausted what he's willing to give you for free. And we're willing to give you a bunch of stuff there for free. So please visit it and take advantage of it.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Our interview here with J. Warner Wallace himself. So pleased to have your time, sir.